Good evening. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement here at JTS, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Jewish Theological Seminary for this year's Gerson D. Cohen Memorial Lecture. In addition to all those gathered here in person, it's my pleasure to welcome all of our live stream viewers across North America. We're really pleased to be able to share tonight's program with you. And we're also excited that a number of synagogues have partnered with us by holding live local screenings of tonight's program. So I'd like to extend a special welcome to our friends at Congregation Beth Am in West Bloomfield, Michigan, Temple Beth Abraham in Nashua, New Hampshire, Temple Israel in Albany, New York, Beth David Synagogue in Greensboro, North Carolina, and any other groups that may be joining us. At this time, allow me to remind you to silence your cell phones. Thank you. The annual Gerson D. Cohen Memorial Lecture was established in 1993 by the late Honorable Howard M. Holtzman, Honorary Chairman of the JTS Board of Trustees, as a tribute to Gerson Cohen, Zichrono Livracha, who served as the Chancellor of JTS from 1972 to 1986. And this month we're marking Chancellor Cohen's 25th yahrzeit, so as a special tribute to his legacy of thought leadership and his far-reaching impact on the American Jewish community, we're really honored to have our current Chancellor deliver this year's Cohen Lecture. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Arnold M. Eisen, Chancellor of JTS, and his topic tonight will be the Blessing of Assimilation, Then and Now, and he'll discuss with us how the issues that Cohen raised in his landmark address, The Blessing of Assimilation, still engage and challenge us today. Chancellor Eisen is one of the world's foremost authorities on American Judaism. He's the 7th Chancellor of JTS. Since taking office in 2007, he's transformed the education of religious, pedagogical, professional, and lay leaders for North American Jewry with a focus on graduating leaders who bring Judaism alive in ways that speak authentically to Jews at a time of far-reaching change. He's increased digitization of JTS library treasures, launched a JTS Fellows program to expand opportunities for adult learning, and developed JTS Torah Online, a rich menu of videos, podcasts, and Torah commentary. That's at jtsa.edu/Torah. His initiatives also include the Block Kolker Center for Spiritual Arts, programs to strengthen early childhood, experiential and Israel education, the Arts Initiative, the Interfaith Center for Pastoral Education, and the Milstein Center for Interreligious Dialogue. Before coming to JTS, Chancellor Eisen served on the faculties of Stanford, Tel Aviv, and Columbia Universities. He is an award-winning writer and advocate for the Jewish community, and his many publications include Rethinking Modern Judaism and, most recently, Conservative Judaism Today and Tomorrow. He contributes regularly to print and online media, including the Wall Street Journal, the Jewish Week, Huffington Post, Tablet, and Fortune, and he discusses Jewish education, philosophy, and values on his blog, On My Mind, Arnie Eisen. And I'm now very pleased to invite you to the podium.
Thanks, Julia. Good evening, everyone. It's a real honor for me to speak about Gerson Cohen, and especially in the presence of people who knew him well and studied with him. I only got to meet Cohen once. We had a conversation the day he offered me a job at JTS. It didn't work out at that point, but it worked out a little later on, I'm happy to say. And we decided that, given that it's the 25th yahrzeit this month, and it's the 50th anniversary of what I think is one of the most brilliant and courageous essays a leader of American Judaism has given in recent decades, to devote the Gerson Cohen Memorial Lecture to the thought of Gerson Cohen about issues of the day. I will try to argue that the things he talked about are even more relevant than they were then. I have found myself, to a degree that constantly surprised me for a while, it doesn't surprise me anymore, that Cohen's policy choices, which I have not known about, directly foreshadowed mine. And I read the rationale for these policy choices, and sometimes I encounter sentences I thought I had written. It's a remarkable experience. And when you read Cohen's addresses on American Jewish life, you find, at least in my view, that the challenge of assimilation is greater now. The blessing is greater, and the cost of assimilation is greater. They're both greater than they were in Cohen's day. Before I turn to that subject directly, I want to emphasize what I'm not going to do this evening. I'm not going to address Cohen's voluminous and penetrating scholarship, except to say that it stands behind every word that he said on current issues. So there are lots of people who say lots of things about the issues of the day. And the thing is, when Cohen said them, you knew what was behind them. I just want to give you one example. In a tribute to his friend Wolf Kelman, the longtime executive director of the Rabbinical Assembly, Cohen offhandedly remarked, and I quote, "The question I ask myself in looking at the rabbinic organizations from the Roman Empire and from the days of the Rashi Galuyot, the heads of the exile, and the Gidim, the princes, is how do we measure up to their standard?" His answer is telling. I think we do not measure up badly at all. But the question is even more telling, because Cohen actually knew in detail the history of rabbinic organizations in every place and time that Jews ever lived. And so when he made a judgment comparing us to them, he knew what he was doing, and he brought this breadth and depth of scholarship to every single thing he said, and he used it, as you're going to see, to debunk established claims about Jewish history and contemporary Jewish events, both positively and negatively, with great authority. He challenged us to do better than our ancestors, who Cohen knew were often guilty of some of the same failings that we display. That could be either comforting or disturbing, depending on your point of view, that here we are hundreds and thousands of years later, displaying the same failings in similar situations with the same patterns. That's the context in which we should approach his argument for assimilation's blessing, which goes like this. Contrary to a well-known saying that attributes Jewish survival over the centuries to the fact that our ancestors did not change their names, their language, or their distinctive dress, Cohen notes that Jacob's grandchildren in Egypt, according to the Torah itself, took Egyptian names, like Aaron or Moses. Right? My parents, good Jews in America, chose to take a really Jewish name like Arnold and name their son with an Arnold, right? Not unusually. And he notes, nor did Jews over the ages refrain from writing, speaking, and giving sermons or praying in languages other than Hebrew, as, of course, I am talking in English right now. And finally, it was not the exception but the rule for Jews to dress like the people in their surroundings, as, let's say, the people in this room right now are indistinguishable from the people walking around outside on the west side of New York. So rather than dress, language, and names being the key to Jewish survival, Cohen says, and here's the key quotation of the essay, which, by the way, was given as the commencement address at Hebrew College in Boston in 1966, a frank appraisal of the periods in which Judaism flourished, right, will indicate that not only did a certain amount of assimilation and acculturation not impede Jewish continuity, but that in a profound sense, this assimilation and acculturation was a stimulus to original thinking and expression, a source of renewed vitality. Okay, so let's note at the outset that Cohen uses the terms assimilation and acculturation synonymously, which most people today would not do, and that he was, of course, aware of the threat that assimilation has always posed to the Jewish group and still did in late 20th century America. But as Cohen immediately reiterates after one such avowal, Jews, quote, have always been and will doubtless continue to be a minority group, meaning, his words, that if we don't want to ghettoize ourselves or fossilize ourselves, we're going to have to adapt to our surroundings. The assimilatory process, he added, was not the consequence of a desire to make things easier, but the result of a need to continue to make the tradition relevant. Right? So assimilation, far from being something we do to make life easier, is something we do to make Judaism relevant to us and everyone else in our time and place. I hope you're getting how strong these claims are. Cohen concluded the essay with a message that was at once lesson, admonition, and plea. Quote, the great ages of Jewish creativity were born out of a response to the challenge of assimilation and there is no reason why our age should not respond to this challenge with equal vigor. So I want to identify 3 different arguments that are going on in that brief excerpt from his piece. He, in fact, elaborated all of them in other articles that he wrote about the Jewish situation, collected in his volume, History and Destiny. And I want to take each of these 3 arguments in turn, evaluate it, and see how it pertains to our situation. Note first the stipulation, which I'm repeating now, that we Jews have always been and will doubtless continue to be a minority group. Well, at first glance, that seems an utterly uncontroversial statement to make, until you realize that there's a standard Zionist argument, which Cohen knew well, which was repeated by luminaries no less than David Ben-Gurion and Gershom Scholem and a whole host of other people, that with the creation of the State of Israel, both galut, exilic existence, and the various galuyot, the various golaz, the various diasporas, have in principle or in fact come to an end. Right? So the Zionist argument is that diaspora is done. Maybe not in fact in certain diasporas like America, but it will soon be done here too. And in principle, it's done everywhere. And either assimilation is going to get you or anti-Semitism is going to get you or both. And Cohen has this in mind, I believe, when he notes that Jews have always been and will always be a minority people, not just in the world, but there's always going to be a diaspora. And he disputes the notion, popularized by Ben-Gurion, and again, stated in scholarly terms with great authority by Gershom Scholem, that with the creation of the State of Israel, Jews re-entered history for the first time in 2,000 years. For Cohen, the historian par excellence of the Jewish people and its ideas, this was an affront. This was patent nonsense, and he said so. The idea that the Jews have not been a part of history or of world culture since the destruction of the Second Commonwealth is an invidious depiction, he said. Now, Cohen was not simply fighting for recognition of what he knew to be simple fact. He believed that matters of contemporary urgency were at stake. For one, the well-being of the State of Israel depended on its recognition of interdependence with the diaspora rather than independence from it and from Jewish history. Boldly setting forth what he called an agenda for interaction between Israel and American Jewry several years after the Yom Kippur War, Cohen asserted that, and I'm going to quote it because the claim is so striking, the dynamics of Jewish history, particularly with respect to Jewish physical security, are as operative with respect to the State of Israel as they have always been with respect to diaspora communities. Here's the case he makes. And it's a strong case, again, especially when considered in light of the frequent Israeli claim that we hear still all the time, for instance, from the Prime Minister of Israel, that Israel represents a break from the patterns of all previous Jewish history and that the rules of diaspora do not apply. Cohen makes the argument several years after the Yom Kippur War that in October 1973, the United States, its president, perhaps swayed by his Jewish Secretary of State, stood in the traditional diaspora role of, quote, strong central authority that had always shown willingness, or often showed willingness, to use its power in defense of Jewish clients. Jewish safety and security then, as always, depended on the largesse of such an overlord, Cohen's word for the United States, an overlord. We might say that this year, on the one hand, that overlord just completed a $38 billion arms deal with Israel, which is an unprecedented amount, and that earlier this year, the United States concluded an agreement, a treaty with Iran, that all Israeli leaders of every party believe constitutes an existential threat to the State of Israel. So, both things that just happened support Cohen's point about the dependence and interdependence. The differences between Israel's power to inflict harm on its enemies today and that of diaspora communities in the past, over the centuries, Cohen argued, should not, his words, obscure the similarities with pre-state history. Israel remains vulnerable, and it remains dependent, a condition well known to diaspora Jews. What is more, Cohen insisted, Israel could not hope to secure continued American assistance on which it depends without the active support of American Jews. And that was the main reason for his concern, and mine, about widespread disillusionment and disinterest with Israel among Jews around the world. He linked this disinterest and disillusionment to what he called the new eschatology of Israeli messianism. That was 1982, and Cohen did not spell out exactly what he meant. I think, from the context, he not only had Gush Emunim in mind, but also the larger hubris expressed in the Israeli claim to represent the sole future for Jewry and Judaism in the world. The argument still heard in our day that Ein Makom Acher, there was no other place for Jews to live but Israel. Note that Cohen worried in 1982 about what we in 2016 call the distancing problem, one which I myself have been writing about since the 1990s. It's not a new problem, in other words. So Haredi attacks on Jews not to their liking, and the tension between liberal-leaning American Jews and Israel's right-wing government have exacerbated tendencies and tensions that, as Cohen shows, have been with us for a very long time. So have the growing disaffiliation of Jews in the United States. If less than 40% of American Jews today belong to a synagogue or any other Jewish anything, it's not surprising that not more than 33% and probably not more than 30% of American Jews say they feel a strong connection to the state of Israel. These tensions are partly rooted, Cohen argues, in the felt need of Israelis, especially secular political Zionists, which is the camp to which the current prime minister belongs, the tendency of secular political Zionists to distance themselves from and denigrate the authenticity and prospects of the diaspora. Why do secular political Zionists want to distance themselves from us and denigrate us? Because im yesh makom acher, if there is another place for Jewish survival, the raison d'etre of Zionism as they see it disappears. If we can thrive, they need a supplementary ideology for why there has to be a state of Israel. And let's say that, of course, distancing has already increased in relationship to the reluctance of younger American Jews to identify with the Jewish people, with the Jewish ethnos, which is a serious problem for conservative Judaism in particular that Cohen addressed and to which I will return. Okay, but this is the situation as Cohen lays it out. And I admire him for being so clear-headed and sober about it. On the one hand, Israel depends upon support from the United States. And American support depends upon the active support of American Jews. On the other hand, Israelis have an interest, not just secular political Zionists, but others, in distancing themselves from diaspora and denigrating the prospects of diaspora survival. And the more that orthodoxy is politically powerful in Israel, the government more and more actively delegitimizes the Judaism that you and I live, which is not the best recipe for getting our support for the state of Israel, and the results are telling. We're seeing growing disinterest and growing disillusionment among younger people in particular. This is why Cohen rallied against negation of the diaspora, because it undermines ends higher than both Israel and diaspora. And that was the same reason why he was upset about disaffiliation in America, why he cared about Jews leaving Judaism. We have a higher purpose here. The higher purpose is the centrality of the Jewish people, his term, and our higher mandate, the Torah. This is absolute bedrock commitment for Gerson Cohen. We stand under the command of covenant, and as a result of that, we accept duties to the land and state of Israel, just as every Israeli Jew, he said, has duties to Judaism and to Jews everywhere. As the covenant weakens, so does the Jewish people, and so does Judaism. I want to make clear, in case it isn't already, that Cohen's defense of the legitimacy of diaspora existence, of us, in no way implies support for the estate of diaspora Judaism as it exists in America today. On the contrary, here's a brief word from Cohen. Given the resources at our disposal, American Jewry may fairly be said to have achieved precious little. Its Jewish ignorance is abysmal. In other words, and I think Cohen would agree with this judgment, assimilation is proving far more curse than it is blessing. What is more, much that we have achieved here is owed to the existence and accomplishments of the State of Israel. Cohen stood for a strong diaspora and a strong Israel, and to that end declared unequivocally that the State of Israel does not determine the state of the Jewish people. There are other things which also determine the state of the Jewish people than the Jewish state. And here's one more final sentence on this subject, which I repeat because it's so strong. And Cohen, as those of you who knew him knew, I mean, he did not mince words. He tended to exercise strong judgments, but he stood behind them, and he knew the history to stand behind them. He said, if the phrase centrality of Israel means that the diaspora is less important than the state of Israel, the idea is repugnant and unspeakable. Very strong language. Well, let me say in 2016 that we are a very long way still from having the conversations between our two communities, American and Israeli, that are necessary to bridge differences that I, like Cohen, doubt can ever be fully overcome. Neither community knows the other very well. We are advancing on very different paths, and these different paths are taking us further and further apart from one another. And both communities are internally divided more and more with each passing year, with less and less dialogue between left and right, or between Orthodox Jews and everyone else. So that brings me to the second piece of Cohen's argument about assimilation that I want to consider. His qualified defense of we Jews who undertake what he called a certain amount of assimilation and acculturation against the threat of ghettoization on the one hand and utter disappearance on the other hand. So let's stipulate, as a segue from the previous topic to this one, that we should not make the mistake of judging American Jews and Judaism by the standards of Israeli Jews and Judaism, or vice versa. If I can speak about this sort of crudely in a colloquialism, Israelis get points, and should get points, for knowing Hebrew and residing in the land of Israel. But, and here's the point that's controversial with some, Jewish human beings who live in North America should also get points for contributing as Jewish human beings to the society and culture and world in which we regard, even if we do these things in English and in non-Jewish contexts. The Jew I meet in a conservative synagogue who comes up to me and says that he is the director of the Environmental Protection Agency in New Jersey and does that because of his conservative Judaism. Or the Jew who assures me that he puts on shows on Broadway that have themes of social justice because of what he learned from Abraham Joshua Heschel about what Judaism demands, those activities get points, as it were. They're Jewish activities. Israelis are rarely willing to accord those points. Neither are many who evaluate American Jews in this country. Gerson Cohen, I'm convinced, thinks differently. He also works hard in his essays to demonstrate that our American Jewish stance, and specifically conservative Judaism, is fully 100% legitimate. I'm going to stipulate that. I'm not going to spend time repeating the arguments that Cohen makes, and there are many, and I invite you to read the speeches and essays in this volume. I'm going to stipulate it and move on to the harder task, the one before us in 2016, which, at least at JTS, is not to prove that our kind of Judaism is legitimate, but to prove that it can work, that it can succeed. That's the hard thing. So recall the ground rules, the givens, of the enterprise that Cohen has laid out. Contrary to what some Jews maintain, change in Judaism is legitimate and necessary so long as it emerges from deep inside the tradition and its community. That's number one. Number two, the sciences, the arts, modern scholarship, in all its forms, are likewise legitimate and necessary to keeping Judaism vital. And third, modernity is not a trap or a curse to be avoided, but an opportunity to be embraced so long as we don't surrender standards rooted in our bedrock commitment to the Jewish people and to Judaism. And that, of course, is the hard part. That's the hard part. How do you enjoy the blessings of assimilation without the curses? Achieving just that certain amount of assimilation and acculturation, not too little, or not too much. To succeed, I think it's obvious, we have to judge each situation accurately, determine the proper measure of assimilation, and then get Jews to act accordingly. All three of these quite difficult. Cohen thought this task, which he called translating the tradition, was possible for us because it had been possible for our ancestors. And so notice, a lesser person than Gerson Cohen might just throw off this generalization, but Cohen is arguing, having mastered the entire sweep of Jewish history, is that the modern situation does not make it harder for us to survive than the ghetto did. In fact, he believed the modern situation is better for Jewish survival and thriving than the medieval ghetto was. And he said, this task of survival in the open society confronts all Jews, but it fronts conservative Judaism in particular because we're committed both to participation in the open society and to full immersion in Judaism. He therefore bemoaned the widespread self-doubt that permeates broad segments of the conservative Jewish community, rabbinic and laity alike, that we're essentially a deviant group. Notice that that is also not a new problem. Conservative Jews have had poor morale for a very long time. This is both comforting and disturbing. The first step towards successful performance of the task before us is to believe wholeheartedly in its rightness and its necessity. A still greater frustration to Cohen was failure on the part of American Jewry and conservative Jews in particular to make the changes and commitments, he called them cornerstones, that the record shows are essential. So he laid out 4 cornerstones essential to Jewish survival, and I'm going to review them one by one. Number 1, committed American Jews have not formulated a new law code, let alone, except for the Orthodox, committed ourselves to any code of observance whatsoever. Agreed. I myself, for reasons I've spoken about many times, prefer to speak about mitzvah rather than law or halacha, and I think JTS's mitzvah initiative has demonstrated the willingness of thousands of conservative Jews to commit to more demanding regimens of behavior than previously. We conservative Jews, however, have not formulated and educated for a coherent set of practices, perhaps fearful that higher standards would drive congregants to reform. I'm going to say, as Cohen did, happy to have his authority behind me, that this was a mistake. We should have aspired to more, even if that meant losing some people. Second, we've not articulated a cogent vision of the Jewish future. Cohen said, settling instead, listen to his phraseology, here's what we settled for: outdated Orthodox dogmas and pretentious claims by Israeli secularists that the state fulfills Jewish destiny. A large bulk of American Jews are caught between one of those two commitments. Cohen considers outdated Orthodox dogma or claims by Israeli secularists the state fulfills Jewish destiny. On the one hand, imagining a pluralistic Israel today seems as far-fetched an exercise as imagining an Israel at peace. We've neglected both exercises in recent years. But what about the rest of the Jewish future? What could non-Orthodox observance of Torah look like here in North America? I note this connection to Solomon Schechter's suggestion in his essay, The Seminary as Witness, that what united Rashi and Rambam and all of the members of what Schechter called Catholic Israel was that they studied the Torah and lived in accordance with its laws, which is Cohen's first cornerstone, and that, quote, they made the hopes of the Jewish nation their own, Cohen's second point. What are these hopes? I would say that our imagination of the Jewish future in North America has been stunted, to say the least. We have not been bold or cogent in our imaginings. Cornerstone number 3, we've not devised new liturgies to guide revitalized forms of worship and practice. Agreed. Progress has been slow and halting. The synagogue remains the key institution of American Jewry, and certainly of conservative Judaism, and for better and for worse, the signature activity of the synagogue remains the Sabbath service. In 9 cases out of 10, and I believe that that's a small c conservative estimate, in 9 cases out of 10, those services are long and lifeless. There are many, many exceptions, dozens of exceptions. which fit within that 10%. There are something like 600 conservative congregations in the United States, in North America right now, perhaps in the United States. So there are many of them that have dramatically good services, and they're not lifeless. They're not dull. And this record has to be extended, improved, and praised. And I'm happy to say we now have a Center for Spiritual Arts at JTS, whose role is going to be precisely that. But I think Cohen's judgment is probably accurate in pointing to the unique power of ritual and worship to contemporary Jewish life and the need for new forms of ritual, new forms of worship, and new content if we're to turn Jews onto Judaism, especially young Jews, rather than turning them off to Judaism as consistently as we do. Finally, Cornerstone 4, we have yet to develop what he called a new curriculum that bespoke the ideal Jew. We've not yet provided Jews with a sense of the supreme, the transcendent importance of their Jewishness. Jewish education should be oriented to a Jewish collective dream. That's Cohen. Imagine orienting Jewish education to a Jewish collective dream, or another formulation, which rings so true in September of 2016. The world stands on the brink of moral collapse. We can survive as a people only if we have our own spiritual well springs. I have to say that nowhere in Cohen's voluminous writings that I have found does he get specific about how to move the community toward this kind of community and this kind of Judaism. So I want to address that challenge in the remaining portion of my talk. I would suggest, first of all, with humble regard to my friend Steve Cohen, who makes a living doing surveys, that we pretty much don't need more surveys of American Jews. We know who we are, we know what our problems are. We know that American Jews are sovereign selves, a phrase that Steve and I either invented or popularized, who must be persuaded to choose over and over again to make Jewish tradition and community central rather than peripheral to their lives. We know in this sense that we are in a late stage of processes of enlightenment and emancipation that began over 250 years ago and are not going to be rapidly reversed. We know that Jews will respond positively to Jewish tradition if we give them what I call meaning with a capital M and community with a capital C. And we know that immersive experiences of meaning community at every point in life, and especially in the years of schooling and emerging adulthood, are crucial to future identity decisions. That's why Camp Ramah, to take an example, is so important. That's why day schools are so important. That's why vital synagogues, and some of them actually have vital schools, are so important. Youth groups, immersive trips to Israel. And there are several other things that we know work, and we know from the data that in every single one of these institutions, the role of individual leaders who provide a role model and inspiration as well as knowledge is utterly crucial. And that's why I feel good that this preparation of leaders is the core business of the Jewish Theological Seminary. Absolutely the core business. So at a time when Jews assert individual autonomy before all things, you cannot reverse the fealty to individual autonomy. What you have to do is persuade Jews that their self-fulfillment lies in community with a capital C and meaning with a capital M. And the evidence for me is that it works, that all sorts of data, including otherwise critical data about the North American Jewish community, proves again and again that these things work, and not just for Orthodox Jews, they work for other Jews as well. I want to say one word about conservative Jews in the spirit of Gerson Cohen. Things were different in 1982 than they are in 2016. We were still riding a demographic wave, even though I think it was clear to Cohen that that wave was about to break a little bit. Sociological factors that worked in favor of conservative Judaism throughout the 50s and 60s and even into the 70s do not work for us now. But I want to make it clear, especially to committed conservative Jews in the room, to JTS students who are banking their future on the future of this kind of Judaism, that numbers are falling, yes, and will continue to fall, but numbers of active conservative Jews are larger than they were 15 years ago. We are nowhere near falling to critical mass. When you have 600 to 700,000 conservative Jews in North America right now, that is not a failure, and we're nowhere near losing critical mass. And finally, I just want to stress, and the only percentages I'm going to give you, that the percentage of American Jews, according to the Pew Report, who are Orthodox is 9, despite 30 years of population growth, 9%. The percentage of Jews who are Reform is 14, despite an overwhelming number of intermarriages, which favor Reform congregations, and the percentage of conservative Jewish members is 11. These are not bad statistics at all. This is nothing to sneeze at. It's nothing to be ashamed at. We're holding our own. And speaking narrowly about conservative Jews, as well as more broadly about American Jews, I would say the future is quite bright. It depends on what we do with it, which is Cohen's point entirely. I have to say, sadly, in that connection, and I would be not true to the data if I didn't mention it, that we have an issue that Cohen did not face to the same degree in 1982, which is, of course, intermarriage. By the end of the 1960s, intermarriage was still in single digits in the United States of America. By 1882, it had gone into the teens. And of course, now we have 72% of marriages in the last 15 years are intermarriages. And what we know so far from the data is that very, very few of those families will choose to lead substantively Jewish lives or to raise Jewish children, and an astonishingly high percentage of those children will end up intermarrying themselves. Well over 90% of them will intermarry themselves. So I don't say this with any relish. Sadly and clearly, it's a problem that we have to deal with. Our task is to persuade more and more non-Jewish members at some point before or after marriage to embrace Judaism, and the way to do that again is not to preach at them, but to give them an experience of community with a capital C and meaning with a capital M over and over again. That is irresistible. That in turn suggests, as Cohen did, that we have to reaffirm our commitment to covenant, its study, and the practice of Torah. I freely admit this is not going to win over huge numbers of sovereign Jewish selves, but it will win over some, and it will retain the allegiance of many who are looking for more rather than less thickness in their Jewish lives, more rather than less opportunities to express their Judaism, more meaning, more community, more spirit, more God, without sacrificing egalitarianism or pluralism or tolerance or democracy or commitments to social justice or all sorts of other things that we Jews find to be non-negotiable. I have to tell you that my very favorite paragraph in the collection of writings in which the Blessing of Assimilation essay appears, called Jewish History and Jewish Destiny, is a speech Cohen delivered to the RA in 1981 entitled Modern Jewish Scholarship and the Continuity of Jewish Faith. It begins with 2 points that I have to believe were addressed, first of all, to Cohen's colleagues on the faculty of the seminary. Quote, to put it succinctly, if learning and scholarship do not affect our religious faith and behavior, if critical learning does not have an effect on our theology, on our experience of God, we have to ask ourselves why we are engaging in it with such tenacity. Amen. Cohen takes as his text Proverbs 3:6. Bechol drachecha da'ehu. In all your ways, know God. And he stresses, of course, using biblical scholarship on the root ladat, that ladat in that verse does not refer to cognitive knowledge or to creedal acknowledgement or to theology, but to personal experience. The verse is telling us, he says, I quote, in all your ways, experience the presence of God. In all that you do, strive to be aware of him. Not just in the synagogue, he adds, but everywhere, ethically, sexually, physically, intellectually, in our intellectual relationships, in all our personal relationships, always applying the basic principles of our tradition and never forgetting that our tradition never insists on a single definition of God or divinity, but has room for many, many such notions. It takes learning to do this, and it takes some courage, because there are always going to be Jews who tell you that it's illegitimate to have the notion of God and to serve God the way you do. I don't see any other path for us today. Judaism must be relevant, it is to prove compelling, it must be adequate in a spiritual sense, in a religious sense, as well as intellectual. Conservative Judaism, like modern Orthodoxy, will attract Jews by the repeated experience of meaning and community on the path of mitzvah that links Jews in New York or Palo Alto or Tel Aviv to one another and links us all to Jews over the centuries and to Sinai, all the while giving us concrete gifts of wisdom and activity to contribute to the world. In the final days of the month of Elul, on the countdown to the Yamim Noraim, I would argue that a certain measure of acculturation is absolutely required for Jews, to say our davar, our word to the world, now as always. You cannot address situations that you don't really know from the inside. You can talk all you want to about environmental change, but it takes some knowledge to actually do something about it. And that holds true in every realm of life. You cannot speak with competence about pressing issues of the day, global warming, or immigration, or hunger, or bullying, without the specialized knowledge that comes from the sciences, the arts, and in-depth experience of contemporary society, family, and institutions. My text for these days, leading up to Rosh Hashanah, would be the ones we read in Parashat Nitzavim, which the rabbis insisted we always read right before Rosh Hashanah. The phrase at the beginning of the Parsha that calls upon all of us to stand before God together, everyone, rich and poor, the stranger within your camp, the Jews who are here this day, and the Jews who are not here with us this day. I would remind us, even in 2016, that the work which we are called to do, while difficult, is not, as Nitzavim says, not too baffling to undertake, not beyond reach, not in the heavens, not across the sea, here for us, in our mouth and our hearts to do. And if someone asked me to boil it all down to an elevator speech, as Moses did at the very end, I'd say, political correctness be damned, that in the most concrete possible ways, the choice between good and evil, blessing and curse, life and death, lies before us now as ever. We have God's assurance transmitted by the Torah and interpreted by the rabbis for 2,000 years that we can choose goodness, blessing, and life. And we have Gerson Cohen's instruction that the choice now as always must be for a way suited to the time and place in which we live, not suited to the time and place in which Jews lived long ago. That's the only way the Torah has ever been lived and taught effectively. In order for it to work, assimilation of a certain degree to a certain measure has got to prove a blessing. 50 years after the delivery of that great address, 25 years after his final words among the living, we remain profoundly grateful for Gerson Cohen's teaching and for his example. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your insights, Chancellor. We'd love to invite all of you, some of you anyway, to ask questions. We've set up a microphone over here. So please do come forward to share your thoughts and questions with the Chancellor. I'm looking for my instructions of how I'm supposed to say this. I think I'm supposed to tell you to be brief and to the point, but I'm not saying it here. So please.
First questioner is always rewarded because you start the flow. It's good. This is, of course, for the live streaming that we're using the mic here.
Well, I'm really glad that you talked about the disparity between the Israeli Jewish community and the American Jewish community. But I don't know if you were aware of the fact that UJA has sponsored a Shaliach program in New York City. And there's a Shaliach who has come from Israel, Kai Pazetsky. And we have two Shinim who have come from Israel also. And the whole purpose of sponsoring the Shaliach and the Shinshinim is to bridge this gap between Israel and the American Jews. It's to introduce American Jews to the Israelis, but also for the Israelis to introduce Israel to the American Jews, because this gap between American Jews and Israel cannot be achieved any other way except by having constant communication between the two groups.
The Israeli would say, 150%, so 150% agreement, right?
Thank you.
And the interesting thing here is I applaud your emphasis, because this is what the data shows, that person-to-person experiences are the most powerful experiences. 99 cases out of 100, you take American Jews to Israel, and despite their exposure to all the problems and all the conflicts and everything else, they come back much more positive. 99 cases out of 100, Reuven Greenwald can correct me, but I think it's true. You bring Israeli shluchim to America, and they go home saying, why did I not know about Judaism of this sort? Like, I have this conversation every summer. I visit 3 different Ramah camps, and I always meet the Israeli shluchim in Hebrew, and that's their constant refrain. Why did no one tell us that this kind of Judaism existed? We didn't know. And why can't we have it when we go back? And then you try to tell them, well, you can actually, but it runs against government funding and government monopoly, et cetera, et cetera. But this is what Cohen's trying to argue for, is that if you're going to have a concept Jewish people, you better have an experience of Jewish people. Cohen writing a book, I'll say this about Cohen. Even Cohen, Eisen writing a book, does not do the trick. It has to be an experience of the reality. And when you experience the reality, it is so powerful, you want more. So my hope for this conversation between American Jews and Israel is not just the shluchim who come here and the American Jews who go there. My hope is the realization that we are engaged in a parallel process. They are building new kinds of Jewish communities. They have recognized that the state cannot serve as the only Jewish community for its residents. We need to have sub-communities. And then the trick is to get those sub-communities to respect each other, of course, which they don't do right now. And we are building new kinds of Jewish communities here. They are revitalizing Jewish tradition and doing it in new ways. And we are revitalizing Jewish tradition and doing it in new ways. And the trick is, as I said, that we're not moving on parallel paths. Our parallel paths, as it were, diverge. So that means the job of translation gets harder and harder. I think that's built into the project. So the Zionist founders may not have known that the creation of a Jewish state was going to make that state increasingly distant from the Jews who remained in the diaspora. Some of them did actually know that. But that's in fact what happened. And that's what Cohen was pointing to in 1982, and that's why I applaud his honesty, because, in my opinion, the degree of frankness that I cited in Gerson Cohen talking about Israel is rarely heard today from Americans or Israelis. Who's going to remind Israelis that you are utterly dependent on our support? You may not like it, but without that $38 billion arms deal, where are you? And that's hard to say. And I think we're too polite. And our politeness is getting in the way of the dialogue that's needed. And so I applaud Cohen for breaking through the politeness. Imagine, several years after 1973, he says this. It was just quite remarkable. We must have other questions to him. If not, I'll have to make up some. Yes, please. And then help yourself to the mic in a minute. Good.
Hi. In order to bridge some of these divides, not only Israel and America, but also between different kinds of Jews in both places, do we have to agree on what Judaism is and what it's for?
Well, then we're done for, because we can't agree on that.
Well, that's the second half. If we can't agree on
And Cohen
that.
tells you we never have. So go ahead. If we can't agree, or we can't.
If we can't agree on that, if we can't even agree what it is, the basic of it, what it's for,
I don't have any illusions.
how can we come together to make it something?
I don't think the knowledge of Jewish history has illusions. In fact, just today, you're not supposed to teach things you've only learned a few hours ago, right? But just today, I'm reading an article, which is a critique by the Israeli philosopher Avishai Margalit of a great new book by the Jewish philosopher Michael Walzer. Well, Michael Walzer says Israeli secularists made a mistake too long by ridiculing orthodoxy and not trying to engage it. And Margalit cites chapter and verse to show that for over 100 years, non-Orthodox Jews have been trying to engage Orthodox Jews and been told either you do it on our terms or we don't talk to you. Now, that seems to me the correct historical record. So, those of us who are conservative Jews or members of what I call the Vital Religious Center, which stretches from modern Orthodoxy, Avi Weiss kind of Orthodoxy, through substantive Reform and Reconstructionist Judaism, and those unaffiliated Jews who care about their Jewish identity. This broad swath of Jews are not held as legitimate by the official Orthodox rabbinate, which is increasingly right-wing and nationalist. Right? So there's an asymmetry here. We tolerate those who tolerate us, and that's the only acceptable stance. We must tolerate and show respect to Jews who do not tolerate and respect us. And that's hard. And I don't pretend that it's easy, and it's not doable at all points. And we can't blame people for getting frustrated. At the moment it gets worse, I alluded to this, but let me spell it out. Cohen could not have foreseen, I see no evidence that he did foresee, the development which in Israel we call Chardal Judaism. Chardal means mustard, and it stands for Haredi Dati Leumi, which is the synthesis of Haredi Judaism with ultra right-wing nationalism. Remember, Haredi Judaism was founded in opposition to Zionism, right? You couldn't set up a state until the Messiah comes. And now we have Haredi Jews who won't celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut, who won't fly the Israeli flag at their yeshivas, but who are right-wing nationalists and are allied with the right of Netanyahu. They're on Netanyahu's right. This is a new issue. So that is a source of great problems for American Jews, because most American Jews still are left of that. Even if they're centrist, they're left of that. And they're not Haredi Orthodox. Haredi Orthodox Jews in America are 6% of the American Jewish population. 6. Despite the birth rate, 6%. So your question is, so where are we? Who said it was easy? And Cohen actually said this. Who said it was easy, right? Who said it was easy? But it's the right job, it's the right task. There's the gentleman who's going to be, ma'am, let him go first because he was before you in the question. Just hang around. Oh, you're leaving? Hang around, and ask the question afterwards. Don't leave.
My question is regarding you refrained a few times about a capital C and capital M.
Yes.
Providing that experience, and how there's a plethora of opportunities that we know work for young adults, whether it's day school, camps. I don't think you mentioned USY, but I'm sure that was on, or youth groups. Okay. Yeah. I'm curious, and then you mentioned how there's a lot of synagogues that have very boring services or declining
not all
memberships.
do.
There are 10% that you
At least.
acknowledge. But I'm curious, how do you provide, or what does capital C and capital M look like for the population of conservative Jews or just Jews in America in general who are not under 20 but are not but are still looking for meaningful experiences in Judaism and can't go to camp or join youth groups and stay school?
Okay, so you don't have to answer this question because you got up there to ask a question, not to answer one. But if I turned around and said to you, what would you want to see? Or what kind of community do you want? What kind of meaning with a capital M do you want? What would you say? If you want to pass, you can pass. But because you're in that age group, right?
Today, I mean, I go to camp and I did youth groups, and I would say,
so
I want more. I love that's where I found connection, was in those experiences.
Exactly.
But I don't know what does that look like when you have a family and you live in a city? And
exactly.
I don't know.
And Hugh Pollack, you have the same experience I do. I go around and adults say to me, why can't our community be like camp was, right? They want Camp Ramah for grown-ups, and they keep wanting to know, why can't we have Camp Ramah? And what they mean, I think, is, why can't I have a community of friends like this with intense relationships and great experiences of meaning and spirituality and campfires and all the rest? So I'll give you a partial answer because the night is young yet. What strikes me is that for all the talk that millennials are not interested in community, and believe me, I hear that argument, and we're studying millennials. JTS is about to do a lot of outreach specifically to millennials because we have to find out if millennials are really different than the older age cohorts were. But if millennials don't care about community, as I sometimes hear, why do they respond so well to camp and to Reshet Ramah, the Ramah Alumni Network, which is bringing them together for social and even religious and spiritual and intellectual purposes? Why do they care about these gatherings? I would believe because the more we are atomized, the more that you friend people as a verb and have fewer good friends as a noun, The average American now has fewer than 3 friends they consider good friends. It goes down every few years. A few years ago it was 4, before that it was 5. 3, less than 3 friends for the average American now. This to me is very sad, right? So I assume that young people don't just want networks and casual acquaintances and the hookup culture. They actually want communities, right? So I think that 10 people around a Shabbat dinner table is worth any number of formal lectures or services or films or anything. 10 people around a dinner table is worth an enormous amount, which is why Ramah and others are investing in those dinner tables. Similarly, meaning with a capital M. I would just say negatively that it's not what's thrown at you in the latest tweet or the latest ad that pops up. It's something that you know has guided people for a very long time and has some wisdom. And I think, despite the evidence of our senses lately, people do have a certain quotient in their heads which knows the difference between real meaning and pseudo-meaning. I think that that sense is operative in people still. And so people know when they're being serious and when they're not being serious, I think. And so meaning with a capital M is when they're serious. And I think we can demonstrate that. I think that's all I'm going to say on that subject. You want to add anything?
Thank you. I was going to ask a similar type question about how we really reach millennials, especially when they're so much into the computer and networking, but not really into personal experiences and
Right, and so this is why JTS is doing a project of outreach right now, and why I'm going to do some research with Stephen Cohen, and why we're co-sponsoring another bit of research about millennials. I can tell you with some authority, because I have spent a lot of time over the last year reading whatever there is to be read about millennials in general and Jewish millennials in particular. Except for the ad agencies, which think they know how to target millennials and get them to buy things, we know very little about millennials. I say we, the collection of scholarship is still, and they're probably too diverse to know. So I'm going to assume, until proven otherwise, that they want experiences of community and they want experiences of meaning. They want personal connection. They want something more lasting in their lives than pop-up ads and tweets. That's what I'm going to assume. How to give it to them and get them to receive it, that's a question. And I think every major federation in the country is investing resources in this right now. And I bet you, because I believe in progress, that 2 or 3 years from now we will know a lot more about this than we do right now. And so again, why not be optimistic about it? Don't give up the ship as lost. There's so many American Jews who will not take yes for an answer. They will not take yes for an answer. And I beg of you, as Cohen did, don't take only no's for an answer. Take some yeses. Believe that we can have a future to build. Yes.
I'm a millennial, and I think that one of the things that turns us off, and I can only speak for myself and my group of friends, is the whole labeling thing. So, conservative, orthodox, yakety yakety, it's just, to me, it's a turnoff. So, so many of my friends in my age group come from very, very mixed families where, for instance, I was born Sephardi. I married an Ashkenaz guy who, his father's Christian, his mother's Jewish. And my kids go to yeshiva, but at the same time, a lot of what I believe in, I believe that a lot of Orthodox, quote-unquote, things are very antiquated, and so it's like, where do there's no room for me or for my friends who think differently. And so all these labels make us feel like we can't affiliate, and as a result, sort of distance, it keeps us distant.
Thank you for saying that. Thank you for sharing that. And that comment is typical of everything that everybody tells me about your generation and the statistics, such as we have them, bear it out. So this was not true in Cohen's day. There was beginning to be this distancing from denominational identity, but it hadn't really taken off yet. And now it's in full swing. And nobody doubts that denominational labels are not succeeding right now. In other words, very few people come to join a conservative synagogue because they are conservative Jews looking for a conservative synagogue. They join a synagogue that gives them what they are looking for, regardless of what denominational label it has or whether it has a denominational label. So that's the first point, and this we find everywhere, and we have to address this, and I know that people in all the various denominations are seeking to address this. At JTS, we have rabbis and cantors who, upon ordination and investiture, are automatically given membership in the conservative rabbinical and cantorial organizations. Many of them will tell you when they come to JTS, they did not come here to be conservative rabbis or cantors. They came here because JTS gives them the best education, the best preparation they can get anywhere, which we believe is true. It might interest you to know that we have 20 new rabbinical students this year. A third of them are converts. It's an incredible number. A third of them had converted to Judaism. All of them from intermarried families. Now, here's what I would say in response to you, though. You have several choices to make, and you alluded to this. So when you go looking for something Jewish, one of your first questions is, how do they treat women? You can answer that question in different ways. I'm not saying you can't choose Orthodox because you're a woman, but I'm saying I assume that question is going to be on your mind, and I would argue that that's a serious matter for a woman to do, and that's a major question, and those of us men who care about this issue as well, that's the first question. Another question I have, when I was looking at a school for my kids to go to, was, do they take Hebrew seriously there? Right? So I already, forgetting denominational labels, I have two criteria in my mind already. I want egalitarianism, and I want Hebrew. I have a third criteria in my mind. I want my kids to know something serious about Jewish texts, Jewish history, Jewish values. So I'm going to choose a camp or a school or a youth group that's going to tell them something serious about Jewish texts, Jewish history, and Jewish values. You can see where I'm going. So even if I don't attach the denominational label, if my criterion are these, I'm going to end up somewhere in what I'm calling the vital religious center of North American Judaism. Whatever the label of that synagogue is, it's going to be of a certain kind of synagogue or a certain kind of school. And most of those synagogues that are going to have what I'm looking for are going to bear the label conservative. Not all of them. BJ happens to be a non-denominational synagogue that meets my criteria. There are others. There are schools like Heschel School that are non-denominational but meet my criteria. But in many cases, the denominational label is going to apply. Similarly, I'm not going to go to a Haredi school. It's going to have the Hebrew I want. It's going to have some of the Jewish learning I want, although the message those kids are going to get are not Jewish values that I want them to get. I think they run counter to the Torah, so I'm not going to send my kids to that school. There are many non-Haredi parents who send their kids to Haredi schools because they don't care enough or know enough to be distressed by the values those kids are getting at those Haredi schools. Another problem conservative Judaism faces is to appreciate conservative Judaism, you have to know something. Because otherwise, it all seems the same. Like, why, you know? So, as a general rule, this problem is much more severe now than it was 30 years ago. Cohen, I know he wouldn't throw up his hands in despair, but the challenge, I think, is greater than it was when he died 25 years ago. We have time for one more question, Rabbi Andelman tells me, and it's yours.
Well, by answering your last question, I think I'm in trouble before I begin, but with your forgiveness, we all applaud change, and I wonder if you could look at the groups that absolutely prohibit change, and I'd like to know your slant on what is the importance of the learning of the Torah from the very earliest age that is possible, age 6 or 5, and how important it is that to the formation of the Jewish neshama. I've become fascinated with the Hasidim of late, and their emphasis is completely on the Torah and not entering into the environment outside. And when they're about 50 or 60, I visited a lot of their families. They show you pictures of their families, starting with 2 people. Their families number almost 100 including their grandchildren, they end up with a tribe of Jews. They don't lose members, they're just gaining their own tribes. So what do you think of that Hasidic slant?
No, it's a great question, and there are many things that I could say in praise of Hasidism, and now I'm going to say a few of them prompted by your question. I'm glad to have the opportunity. Because as Cohen teaches, we're in this as one Jewish people and one covenant, and Hasidim may not count me as a legitimate Jew, or my kind of Jew. They would count me as a legitimate Jew because my mother was a Jew. But they won't count my Judaism as legitimate. In fact, they won't set foot, most of them, in this building except for the library because there are holy books there because the building is treif and they won't be seen here. But nonetheless, I value what they're doing. So here's several reasons why I value what they're doing. Number one, Chabad in particular has a magnificent theology that is very close to what Gerson Cohen was arguing for in B'chol D'rachecha Dayu. That God, Shekhinah, God's holiness utterly surrounds us. It's here in this room, it's here everywhere, and if you don't see it, it's your blindness and not God's absence. And to be aware of God is to be elevated to a kind of joy and contentment in life, which one doesn't have elsewise. And that's a central Lubavitcher Hasidic teaching, which I very much respect. I appeared, and perhaps still do, on the Chabad website, because I was once filmed at an event saying that I hope that all of our future rabbis and cantors show their love of Jews and their love of Judaism as well as Chabad rabbis do. They liked that I said that, and so they filmed the Chancellor of JTS saying that, and I believe it's true. Furthermore, here's two more. My wife and I have a good friend who was born a German Protestant. She decided when she was about 20 that she wanted to study the Talmud. Quote, because I wanted to study the literature of the people that my people tried to destroy. End quote. She fell in love with the Talmud, and several years later she converted to Judaism because she wanted to belong to the people that created the Talmud. The Talmud is kept alive in part by places like JTS which study it. But let's be honest, the Talmud is here thanks to the tens and tens of thousands of ultra-Orthodox Jews who only do that every moment of every day. They're performing a service. We know the Talmud will always survive because of them, even though they're not going to read it the way we're going to read it. We're grateful to them because they're keeping the Talmud alive. And finally, they're having Jewish babies.
Yes.
And this is a not insignificant contribution to the future of the Jewish people. There is no Judaism without Jews. I also think there's no Jews without Judaism. They're making Jews. The only reason the state of Israel is not already overwhelmed by a demographic problem of imbalance with Arabs is because of Haredi birth rate.
Yeah.
That Haredi birth rate in the next 30 years is going to overwhelm the population of the state of Israel. It will probably devastate the economy, but I think something will change between now and then. The Haredim will join the workforce because there's no option.
Yes.
I don't think that's going to happen here, but there's a similar process. So I think you're all seeing that all of us Jews have a lot of debt to pay to other Jews, and we should think of it as we are grateful to other Jews, and we have the burden, which is what Cohen teaches, understand their kinds of Judaism, even if they don't understand yours. By understanding where we all come from, including where they come from, you have an entree to conversation with them, which they may take up or not take up as they see fit, but at least you're doing your part of the bargain. I think that, given in a world of 7+ billion, I think it is, and we are not much more than 15 million, some people think 16 million, with the project of American Judaism imperiled by assimilation, and the project of Israeli Judaism imperiled by all sorts of threats that we know about, internal and external. If we Jews can't know each other and talk to each other, where are we? And I'm hoping that understanding more about the history of where we came from is going to actually inspire us to be stronger Jews. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chancellor Eisen, for bringing Chancellor Cohen's ideas to us on the occasion of his 25th yahrzeit and really bringing them to bear on the biggest issues that we're all preoccupied with for the Jewish present and future. I want to thank everyone for coming, those in the room and those joining us via live stream. We'd love to have you back at JTS for our many community learning programs. You'll find literature on the table in the hall or at jtsa.edu/community-learning. And in advance, I wish all of you Shana Tova U'Mitzuka.